So we're on chapter 24 and we're going into the third section of your U.S. history book. We're going to be talking about President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal program. We just got into the whole episode on what was going on during this time. Prior to this, during President Herbert Hoover's administration, we had the stock market crash, and then after the stock market crash, going into a Great Depression. So these are going to be the Depression years on to, we'll find as Franklin Roosevelt as president will go on into World War II. So, but we're going into this section, we'll talk about the landslide victory, Roosevelt's victory in becoming president, Roosevelt's advisors, onto his New Deal legislation, and what he's doing in foreign affairs this time. And then, of course, there's going to be opposition to the New Deal and on to his second New Deal. So let's begin. Here's a picture of Roosevelt and his wife, Eleanor. She actually became very involved in the political scene at that time, being his greatest advisor. So let's begin. Government programs. Well, during the Great Depression, many people would become dependent on the government for their financial needs. In 1932, the Depression was at its worst, as you can see with these pictures. America was very open to socialism at this time. And of course, at this time, socialists want to take control of America, right? Was this a time for the government to take control, or was it a time for the government to lay back? What actually happened, during this Great Depression, and possibly prolonging the Great Depression? So here we have some pictures here of during the Great Depression. So. The landslide victory of 1932. So the Republican was President Herbert Hoover. He became president in 1928 and 29, taking on the Great Depression. And so, but he believed in limited government intervention to restore the economy. And basically, he believed is that the American people basically able to take control, and businesses giving more power to individuals, right? Well, the Democrats had the opposite belief at this time. And under the governor of New York was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he ran for the presidency against Herbert Hoover. His vice president, John Garner of Texas, would be Speaker of the House, so it would run with Franklin Roosevelt. It said, clearly Hoover could not be blamed for the Depression. In fact, when he took office, the Depression was not on anybody's mind. America was prospering at the time. And he only had taken office a few months before Black Tuesday, when the stock market fell, right? On that terrible day. But FDR's, when I talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I'm going to be calling him FDR. That's what usually we call him, so you don't get mixed up into Teddy Roosevelt, which actually he was related to Teddy Roosevelt, a prior president. So we're going to call him FDR. So, but FDR's campaign rhetoric blamed Hoover and accused President Hoover as promoting the greatest spending in peace times in history and possibly causing the Great Depression, which he did not. FDR believed this was a time of aggressive, firm action needed by the government. The government needed to take control in certain areas. But all of his recommendations were pretty vague and indefinite at the time. But he did promise to balance the budget. Now, would he really balance the budget? He'd be a big spender of the budget, right? And he focused on the greatest concern was that he wanted the average American not to be forgotten. So that was his campaign, The Average America Not to Be Forgotten. Well, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, wins by a landslide victory and becomes the 32nd president of the United States. So here he won all of these countries, as you can see here. His term would go on. You can see only a few states covered the Republican votes. So Herbert Hoover lost the election, and FDR became the president of the United States, 32nd president. FDR, the new president. So let's talk about FDR personally, So he had his public career of 25 years experience. So he was born in 1882 in Hyde Park, New York. He was the only child in his family to James and Sarah, and they were very wealthy and influential. That's totally different from Hoover. Remember, Hoover was an orphan, But his private education, he went on to Harvard. It's kind of weird because Hoover was educated at Stanford University in California, and we have FDR being educated at Harvard. And then he went on to Columbia Law School as a lawyer. In 1910, he began his political career as a New York senator in the Senate. And he always supported Woodrow Wilson, Democrat, back when. So he was under Woodrow Wilson. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I. So FDR had a lot of experience. In 1920, he campaigned with Cox of Ohio unsuccessfully for president against Harding. Harding won. So he already ran with campaigning for president as vice president. And he had lost, but he had all this experience. The thing about he endorsed the League of Nations. Remember the League of Nations back when were basically forming after Woodrow Wilson was so into forming a League of Nations to have this world order, in the midst of it. Well, Rosa, especially his wife, Eleanor, his picture of Eleanor, she really supported the League of Nations. In fact, she would be the top supporter of the United Nations later on. So she was very much a globalist. And in a sense, so was FDR to some extent, but his wife especially. So here's a picture of him with with his children in the midst of here. I don't know. I think this is his wife there, Eleanor. But anyway, and so here's a picture of when they were younger. And here we have a picture here. And we'll see that he develops polio, and FDR is known as the president who was in a wheelchair. So he was in a wheelchair, although he did later on walk with braces, and we'll find out a little more about that in just a bit. FDR contracts polio. So in 1921, FDR's back and his arms and his hands became partially paralyzed, and he couldn't even hold a pen to write. So he was diagnosed with polio. Back in that time, they called it infantile paralysis, which usually because polio was very common, mainly among children at that time. But he was diagnosed with polio. And he fought back with polio by exercising. He learned to walk with braces, and he gradually regained the use of his hands. So in 1924, he was still active in politics, and he still was governor of New York between 1928 and 1930. So involved, despite having to be in a wheelchair most of the time, he went on with his life. So he was definitely a trooper, let's just say that. In 1932, he had the victory in the presidential election, and this was the peak of his career, of course, when he first became president. So here we have a picture in his wheelchair here. Here he's swimming to exercise for polio. Here's a picture of him, FDR. FDR and the 20th Amendment. In 1932, of course, the Depression was at its lowest when FDR became president. But between the election time, so the 20th Amendment is called the lame duck Amendment. Why? Because the president would take his inaugural speech, in the beginning of January, or usually in the beginning of January. So, but now, before this, or I should say before this time, from November 1932 to March. That's a long time. In November, the elections are in November, and he won. So he had to wait. Usually now they usually give their inaugural address in January, but they had to wait all the way to March to give their address to take hold. So during this period of time from November to March, November, December, January, February, March, that's like 4 months time period, they would not be able to take become president. It was called the lame duck period because we knew the president had lost, but for these 4 months. Now, why did they have that before? That 4-month period? It was this long period of time. It was because way back in the 1700s, basically in Washington's time and Adams' time, and they had to have this time for a period of transportation so that they could get everything move to where they need to move and get things ready. So they gave this time as a period of time for the president to get ready. Well, they didn't need that now at this time. So the 20th Amendment of 1933 would say that the president shall take office on January 3rd. So it'd go from November to January, and then they'd be inaugurated on January 20th. And that's what it is today. So this eliminated this lame duck Congress, because this whole time, this 4 months, Congress would just be waiting to take hold. So they wouldn't do anything much. For 4 months, they just sit and wait till the president took office. And so FDR was the last president that was inaugurated on March 4th. So he would be the last one to have this lame duck, because they passed this 20th Amendment that they would do away with this lame duck period. So just remember, it's kind of weird when you hear lame duck, what it means. So the 20th Amendment. So, and he'd be the first president, to be inaugurated in January 20. So FDR launches the New Deal. This is what he's known for, right? You always know Roosevelt, of course, he was a president during World War II. We'll find that out. But he also was the president that launched the New Deal. Remember Roosevelt? Teddy Roosevelt had the Square Deal. He wanted to give all Americans the Square Deal. That was his actually cousin back then. But now FDR would have the New Deal. This would be new. So FDR became the 32nd president, and he had a very endearing personality. Americans loved him. He had apparent confidence. He was very enthusiastic, and he suggested new hope for the future. So when Americans looked to him, they looked to him for hope. He said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And also because here he had got through with trooping through this time with polio, and here he became president as a handicapped president in a wheelchair. So Americans looked at him with great hope. So he called his plan for legislation the New Deal. On March 9th, 1933 to June 19th was 100 days. So the 100 days were the period of time to put his New Deal into work, into legislation. So between March 9th, when he took power, to June 19th, people in Congress, they all got busy. All the Democrats got busy in promoting all of these different proposals that would happen. And they called this period 100 days. 100 days to get the legislation that they wanted to be passed during this time. So the 100 days of starting the New Deal. They always called it 100 days period, starting the New Deal. So there were mass legislation for social reform and economic recovery, all these in this 100 days. They tried to put through all these proposals, and Congress would approve all of his proposals, which is very unusual, and there were a lot of them. So here it says the first 100 days, Roosevelt called Congress into a special session that lasted from March 9th to June 6th. In the first 100 days, it passed more significant legislation than it usually manages in 2 years. So 2 years of legislation went through that just quickly, they're passing them through in a 100-day period. FDR's advisors, he called them the Brain Trust, and most of them were college professors. Here's some of the Brain Trust here. We have Rexford Tugwell, Raymond Moley, Adolph Burley, and it's base here. It says basically his greatest brain trust would be his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. But we also have Harold Ikes, Secretary of the Interior, Francis Perkins, Secretary of Labor, Henry Wallace, Secretary of Agriculture, Harry Hopkins. But the thing about the college professors and his brain trust, they approved they used the untried and unproven economic theories of John Maynard Keynes. So John Maynard Keynes was actually, he was an economic theorist, and he had put forth his theory of how the economy should work. And so they would take into his theory and try to put it into action. Keynesian politics, they call it now. The thing about, what is Keynesian politics? Well, basically, he believed the government must be involved in the economy to keep it safe. And to get rid of economic depression, a government must spend more money. He was into the government spending more and more money, right? To keep the depression going. The government, deficient spending is needed. So basically, the government could be in debt. It didn't matter. Just keep spending money, right? Not the greatest plan, I don't think, but that actually was to be involved, the government to be fully involved, almost to the point. Well, Keynesian politics is very socialistic. So anyway, he was a Keynes was a British left-wing economic theorist. He believed in massive economic and social intervention of the government. Basically going in and controlling the economy and controlling the social life of Americans. And he thought this was very needed in times of depression. So the Keynesian theory was the great problem the Keynesian theorist thought was unemployment. So they would call the federal government to create jobs by spending large amounts of money for public works, construction, and public employment of workers. So basically, to help people, you had to spend a lot of government money, right? That's Keynesian politics. And that's what FDR focused on during this time. So the New Deal became more of a socialist democracy. In fact, you would call it, if you went back and you had a test question that said, which president would be the most socialistic president, you would have to see FDR was. But it was a time that things were very confusing, and the world was in economic depression, not only America, but the whole world. So it was a time where Americans were looking for some hope, and they would want to put hope in a leader such as FDR. So basically the New Deal would substitute economic security for economic freedom. Like, we'll take care of you, but we're going to take away some of your freedoms and tell you what to do, right? So here we have democratic socialism, where everything is free except for you. You're not free, but everything else is free. I like here what Alex de Tocqueville said. He said, democracy and socialism have nothing in common but one word, equality. But notice the difference. While democracy seeks equality and liberty, that's freedom, socialism seeks equality and restraint and servitude. So socialism can lead to communism and dictatorship. So you have to watch that. So anyway, the socialist democracy under FDR would have to reinterpret the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution to bring in their whole plan. So the federal government should not simply create the conditions for happiness and prosperity by providing federal generated and guaranteed jobs, housings, income, old age, pensions. All these things were going to come in with the New Deal. Now, some of these things are going to be good, and some things are going to be needed, of course, but others are going to be a step forward of more government control. The New Deal was a large step away from the constitutional federal republic towards socialist democracy based on false equality. So it was a large step away from the Constitution in itself. So the New Deal had some big errors or big problems when dealing with the Constitution and controlling the rights of the people. FDR's cabinet, okay, you're probably not going to remember these names, but his cabinet were all promoted with the socialistic agenda that was at hand. Henry Morgenthau Jr. was the Secretary of Treasury. Harold Ikes was the National Resources under the Secretary of the Interior. Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture, for government control of American farms and agriculture. He definitely wanted the government taking control of the American farms, you see there. James A. Farley, the Postmaster General. Cordell Hull was the Secretary of State and had a key role in the international relations. So he had these very much of a socialistic cabinet. And to top off, he had one of the first women. Frances Perkins was one of the first women in the cabinet as a Secretary of Labor. And she would also play a key role in the New Deal. Here's a picture of her there, talking to the president. So that's Frances Perkins. And here's his cabinet members. And you can see FDR's cabinet. I'm not going to say they all were socialistic, but they were all bordered and they agreed with the New Deal. So the First Lady was the chief advisor under, you could say, a Roosevelt, Eleanor. Eleanor Roosevelt lived 1884 to 1962, and she would travel the country representing her husband as president. Because of his illness and polio, she would actually act as his not just secretary, but his speaker. So you see her a lot. Here she's speaking. She spoke a lot for her husband. This is the first chief advisor being first lady doing these kind of things ever. So this is a precedent was set as first lady actually being involved in any type of humanitarian life as a president's wife. So Eleanor Roosevelt was a powerful figure, and she promoted a lot of different welfare programs. She was a New World Organization. She was the one that believed in the League of Nations under Woodrow Wilson, which failed. And later on, she would be the United States delegate to the United Nations. She was in full support of the United Nations. Very much of a globalist, when you think of Eleanor Roosevelt, believing that we should have one center world order. So she definitely was a New World Order person back then at that time, if you could even say New World Order. This is before Israel became a nation, But anyway, she was very involved in these pictures you see here. This is with the soldiers. Here we have, this is a different picture. Look how she looks very beautiful in that picture there. I've never seen that picture. This is her wedding picture. And here you see she's speaking, and here she's supporting her husband. I like what she says here. She said, "A woman is like a tea bag. You never know how strong she is until she gets in hot water." Well, I don't know about that one, but I've heard that saying before. So Roosevelt's relief, recovery, and reform. So relief, think of relief, recovery, and reform all going together. And he put it through his FDR's fireside chats on the radio. So he'd speak to the nation, to the common people on the radio of exactly what he was going to do. He would use the authority of the government as an organized form of self-help for all classes and groups and sections of our country. So he was using the authority of government to try to help them. First of all, relief was to the government to give immediate relief to the needy. There's the needy. A lot of people were out of work. There were a lot of homeless. So government to give immediate relief to the needy. Recovery to nation's economy with political and social reforms. So he wanted to then focus on the nation's economy and the recovering of the economy from depression, and on to reform to prevent disasters from reoccurring. And all these things, and so to say, are important. So it's not that he, in the mind of trying to point through to give immediate relief to the needy. Yes, to help the economy politically and social reforms, but just the extent to what it was done. So, and also to prevent disasters from reoccurring. So, but the best New Deal was to bring hope and confidence to the people. And he did so. He was very good at that, at the fireside chats, talking to the people via the radio with millions of people listening to him. And the American people, he wanted to recover from adversity in the midst of all of this. But the relief measures set a precedent for direct government intervention and involvement in the lives and property. So what this is saying, this was all good, yeah, relief, recovery, and reform, but it set a precedent for the government to be controlling, right, and intervening and involving not only, in helping, but also in controlling the lives of the individual. So it set a precedent for socialism and for communism in the long run, if that would go that way. The early New Deal legislation in 1933, we know that scores of banks were failing, bank runs, people were rushing to withdraw all their money from the bank. So this was going on, we're talking about the beginning in 1929, but this had been going on. The banks were failing. And so people trying to withdraw money, and banks every day were failing. So because banks only have a fraction of money on reserve, they only have a little bit. If you go to your bank, they don't have a lot of money. So if you want to withdraw $1 million, it'd be hard for them to give you $1 million cash, because they actually take our money and invest it for us a lot of times, or they don't have the cash there. So it was impossible to meet the demands when people would come running to the bank and everybody wanted to get their money out, right? So the government of Michigan, they had the idea of stopping the bank runs by declaring a bank holiday. They said, the bank's on holiday for 8 days, and this would give the banks time to calm the fears of the people and to assure that their money was safe so people wouldn't run to the banks. So they'd say, we're on holiday. And so President FDR took this and declared a national bank holiday for the United States of America would have a national bank holiday, and closed all the banks in the United States, putting temporary embargo on gold and basically holding the banks. The banks of the entire nation are closed for a brief holiday, he said. So here we have the banking reforms of 1933 would start with FDR putting the banks on a holiday. The Emergency Banking Relief Act of 1933. This would pass March 9th, right when he took, right in the beginning here of 1933, March 9th, President was giving a broader control in the banking so that he could put the banks on holiday, and he could also reopen them just as he saw fit. So he could open and close the banks. That's a big deal for a president to have to be able to do that. But anyway, so in late March, but most of the banks were reopened. So he put them on holiday, closed them down, and then he reopened them. On April 5th of 1933, he took the country off the gold standard. Now that it would not be in the gold standard, so you couldn't take your money and exchange it for gold anyway. So all private held gold except jewelry and coin collections had to be returned to the Federal Reserve banks. So except for the fiat money. But anyway, if you had gold, you had to return it to the banks. Paper money could no longer be redeemable for gold. No more gold standard here. And this really shook the public's confidence in United States monetary system. And like, okay, what's he doing here? We can't, redeem our money for gold. And any gold we have to bring it back to the bank. So, and the Emergency Banking Act also allowed only Federal Reserve approved banks to operate in the United States. So you had to be approved by the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve's getting a lot of power here, which is the government. The Emergency Banking Relief Act gave the federal government the right to regulate banks and rushed money to reopen banks. So they were in the midst of all this. The Emergency Banking Relief gave emergency banking power to the president and to the Federal Reserve. So creating inflation and FDIC. So what's this? Well, to attempt to stimulate the economy by creating inflation, the Federal Reserve would print more money. So we had a lot more money, but the money was not worth as much. And so this reduced the gold value of the dollar to only 59 cents or 0.5906 or 59% of former value. So anyway, here it was down to 59 cents. So the paper currency would be unredeemable and only partially backed by gold. And millions of Americans have lost their savings in the midst of this. And so basically FDR looked to establish what's called the FDIC. And we have this today when you put your money in the bank now. So, and this was an insurance that the insurance company would cover your money in your bank up to $100,000 at that time. So the FDIC Corporation created this banking account with insurance for your money up to $100,000 so that you could put your money in the bank and you'd still be able to, the insurance would cover. If there was a bank that went bankrupt or the bank would close the doors, you'd be able to get it back now because it'd be backed by the government's Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. That's what FDIC stands for, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. And it was established, we still have it today, on June 16, 1933. It's good to know that if you have money in your bank now, I think it's up to like $200,000 now, but the FDIC would cover you so you won't lose all your money in the bank, in your savings. So let's stop there and we'll go on to the other New Deal in the next video. There's a lot of other things that he did, of course.